They say ignorance is bliss, but as a lifelong journalist, I really couldn't disagree more. If there's something shocking to know, I want to know about it, and I want you to know about it too. I'm Peggy Bunker, and I can't wait for you to know it all. This season's focus, do we even know what we're eating? The truth about factory farming. Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Know It All. I'm Peggy Bunker and really glad that you're here with us today because we have a very interesting guest, a very funny guest, who's really walked both sides of the animal activism and also vegetarian to carnivore side of the road. We're talking to Nicolette Hahn Niman. She married Bill Niman, one of the most famous ranchers in Marin County here in California, started an ethical ranch where they still raise and slaughter animals, but they do it in an ethical fashion. She went from being a vegetarian for 33 years to eating cheeseburgers across the table with her husband. And now she has a very unique perspective on so many animal issues, raising animals for food. How do you raise them to have just one bad day and also take care of the environment that's under their feet at the exact same time? Very excited to interview and talk to Nicolette Hahn Niman.
I have it's kind of a varied background. Most of my time these days is spent writing and speaking about the way animals are raised for food. But I live on a ranch and I'm part of a ranch. So I also help out on a ranch a little bit every week. And there was a time when I was working full time on the ranch. I'm not doing that right now, but I do help out regularly. And then I have two young sons. So every day, a lot of my time is spent, at their soccer games and practices and stuff like that. And so I'm kind of a mother, and I was a lawyer for many years. That was my original profession. And then now I'm writing and speaking about, really, I'm focused on trying to improve the way we raise animals for food.
And even just for me, I don't necessarily think I would use this, but tell me exactly why you and Bill decided to step away from Niman. I mean, it's his namesake and your namesake. What was there, like, just the ideologies diverged?
Yes. Well, of course, I think this is kind of a classic thing with founders where you have a very specific vision when you start a company, and then as it grows, it's harder and harder to stay precisely on that vision. And also you sort of lose control over the decision making. And I think Bill was getting frustrated. Some of the things that were being done were not exactly as he wanted them done. So he just decided it was the right time to step away and allow the organization to continue without him.
And I've done even Animal Place. They're up in outside of Petaluma, and they say basically her opinion was there's no way to raise animals for food in a humane fashion because at the end of the day, they all get killed and they would all rather not get killed. I don't know how reasonable that theory is, but many people have it. There is no humane way to raise animals for food. What is your take on that?
Well, I mean, I would say, first of all, obviously every living creature, whether it's plant or animal or fungal, will die at the end of it, at some point. And so I don't think saying an animal is going to be killed or is going to die basically in the system makes it inherently inhumane. But I do agree that there's a really high standard that we all have to, hold ourselves to if we're involved in raising animals for food. And I think the big problem today is that the sort of normal system, the, quote unquote normal, the thing that's the dominant model is clearly not upholding our standard to animals. So I think people have increasingly begun to believe that it's not possible to raise animals well. And I really disagree with that because I've lived for the last 19 years on a ranch and I know what we do every day and I know how our animals live. And I have been on many really good farms and ranches around the country and around the world even, and seen the same thing, seen animals that have very high quality of life and also whose deaths are very carefully managed. And so the concept with, if you're really taking care of animals, you want to make sure that from birth all the way to the end of their life, they're not experiencing any unnecessary pain or fear. And I think that's absolutely possible to do. And I believe we're doing that.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting take. And it's one of those that you hear people argue there is no humane way to slaughter an animal, but at the same time, we are grappling with the fact that many, many people eat meat. They're going to continue to eat meat, whether we make it a humane existence or not. And wouldn't the alternative for the environment, for the animal, et cetera, if we, continue to eat meat to make it a more humane process? That's sort of the side that I personally subscribe to. I don't eat meat, but I understand that not everybody can adopt that attitude. How do you think it got so bad? How do you think we have, I'm sure there's farmers out there who probably started, maybe took over their parents' farm or what, and kept getting squeezed financially or what have you. How did it get so bad that we've actually, cows are now just living inside constantly? There's no farm, there's no grass. They live in sheds, they can't move. Hogs are, completely contained in these horrible gestation situations, those crates. How did it get so bad where these animals don't even have the ability to move or have outside access?
Well, I think, I've written 3 books about the way, what I would argue is kind of the best way to raise animals for food, both from an ecological and from an animal welfare standpoint. And the first book that I wrote is called Righteous Porkchop, Finding a Life and Good Food Beyond Factory Farms. And so I was really focused on that very question, is like, how did we get here? Why and how did we get here? And is there a way out of this? And so I really examined kind of the history of industrialization of the whole food supply. And what I really realized is that first of all, it was not kind of an inevitable process. It was something that happened as a result of individuals that saw an opportunity under our capitalist system, to make more money. And really it started out there were a number of factors that kind of coalesced. For one thing, there was a lot of focus on making grain cheap, feeds cheap. And the government believed at that time that was a necessary thing to do to produce enough food. And a lot of that was after World War II and trying to produce additional grain supplies for Europe and other parts of the world where there were a lot of hungry people after World War II. So there was this kind of deliberate infusion of resources into producing more grain and soy and other things like that. That made feed so cheap that you could actually raise animals in a much cheaper way. And you could actually, like, for example, with dairy cows that you mentioned, you could, rather than having them graze grass, which, is kind of a free resource in a way, although it's not free because you have to pay for the value of the land, but still, it isn't something you have to buy and bring to your farm. But rather than having dairy cows on grass, we began around that time to feed them grain and more and more. And that was kind of happening throughout the whole animal farming system, is there was feed instead of, because pigs and chickens and turkeys had historically been fed on kind of leftover farm byproducts and, food scraps is what I meant to say. And so you'd have small flocks and herds of chickens and pigs scattered all over the country. Every farm used to have a couple of dairy cows, a small herd of pigs, a small herd of chickens. And they were fed individually on that farm by what was kind of available. And so it was a very economical system, not a wasteful system. It was a very ecologically sound system, and one that gave animals a much better quality of life because they were living, generally outdoors, and they were living, on these mixed farms. They had interesting lives, and they weren't confined continuously. They had exercise, they had sunshine, they had fresh air, and it wasn't crowded. So things really shifted around 1950. We began to have a lot of feed available cheaply as a country, and we began to bring animals indoors, especially first the chickens, then the pigs and turkeys. And so we went to a system where it was really what I would call industrialized, and we made a kind of a more complicated, ecologically sound system into one that was much more like an industrial operation. And it was very segmented, very specialized, very single focused. Farming went from, sort of complex systems with lots of things, lots of plants and animals mixed together, to very singular production, whether it was producing wheat or whether it was producing pigs. Farms began being monocrop, sort of one thing was being produced. So it was quite a dramatic shift. And then we began, again, in the 1950s, many farmers began to add antibiotics to the feeds. And that was, again, to sort of enable this more crowded kind of system. And it stimulated the growth of the animals, but it also allowed more crowded conditions to persist. And so there were all kinds of things that were pushing agriculture in this direction. And I think at the time, it was not fully understood how problematic all of this was going to be from both an ecological standpoint, from an animal welfare standpoint, and even a human health standpoint.
Yeah, that's the first thing I think about as I hear you go over some of that history, which is so amazing how it has evolved and based on the affordability of grain. But the crowding and the bringing the animals inside is directly responsible for so many of the viruses that we now deal with, including COVID. If you look back at COVID and you look at the whole, Wuhan situation and the debates on that, but from what all the scientists basically have gathered is that was a crowding of animals coming together. And when we have salmonella outbreaks in, say, like an egg farm, and as a former, journalist, I always had to cover those stories as a food illness, like an E. coli story versus like in terms of human health, not the terrible conditions these animals are being tortured in, but as a human food safety story. And I always thought the bigger story was that, yes, but look at this shed with 400,000 birds in it. Of course, there's salmonella on these eggs. Of course, people are going to get sick. Same with E. coli and dairy farms. You look at dairy farms, these animals standing in their own waste and this recycled water that's atrocious. And it's all very shocking. Do you feel frustrated that even with the human health component in there, where this overcrowding of animals who are being forced to live indoors, people only seem to pay attention to the health outbreaks, like the E. coli outbreaks and the salmonella. Do you think that as a society we're focusing on the wrong issue?
Well, I would agree that the conditions, the system, the problem is the system. It's really an unhealthy system. We're not really ever going to be able to produce healthy food, and we're not really ever going to get beyond this risk, this pandemic risk. In fact, in the book I was just talking about that I wrote a number of years ago, Righteous Porkchop, I talk about this very issue, the fact that this crowding and then this overuse of antibiotics, the combination of those two factors, has really led to a sort of very widespread situation where you're at risk of creating novel viruses and novel diseases all the time, because there's so much disease transmission and there's just so much, the conditions are perfect because they're crowded together and they're not getting a lot of fresh air. In fact, a lot of these operations are known to have to have continual air circulation 24/7. And when the ventilation systems fail, the animals will all die fairly quickly. So this is kind of well known, that this is an unhealthy environment, and that you sort of have to continually vent the air out. And I think now there are some things that are beginning to happen on that. And disease risk is one thing, and I think a lot of people are concerned about animal welfare. And I've been working on these issues for 22 years, and I have to say there is a dramatic difference in how much awareness people have now compared to when I started. When I used to describe my work to people, they literally, and I lived in New York City, so it was, people were very removed from farming, as you know, in that environment. So I would talk to people about what I was doing, and people just didn't have any understanding at all about how animals were being raised for food. I think that has changed a lot. When I talk to people, just kind of an ordinary conversation with someone that I meet, at a dinner party or whatever, I find that they have a much deeper understanding today than they did a couple of decades ago about the way animals are raised for food. So I think that's progress.
I totally agree, and I'm so happy to hear that. I am so happy to hear that. That's great because I know a lot of people talk to you about this topic, so that makes me happy to hear that you see change. I know you're really interested in. Are you writing a book now on the antibiotic factor, or are you going to write another book? Or I know this is a big topic of you, so let's get into the antibiotic situation.
I'm not writing a book on that topic. There have been some good books written on it, but no, but it's always part of what I've written articles about it, and I've written about it in my book. All of my books have mentioned it. And actually, I have a sister who's an infectious disease specialist, so I'm always talking to her about these issues. Whenever I have a question, I just call her up. But it's really, to me, the antibiotics issue is a really important one because, we have to have food systems, whether you're raising plants or animals. You have to have food systems that produce healthy food and that are ecologically sound. And there's this sort of focus now, this new idea of, it's not new really, but there's more conversation about it. This idea of truly regenerative farming, where you're actually farming in such a way that you're not just not causing damage, but you're actually restoring the ecological processes that really power the whole ecosystem where the farm is. And it wasn't fully, I don't think, recognized until fairly recently that this was possible to do. I think farming has been done at least in the industrialized world for the last 100 years or so in quite an extractive way. This idea being that you kind of, there was like essentially virgin land. You go there, you would farm it for a while, and then, you'd move on. That's actually kind of what humans did for much of human history in a lot of parts of the world. There's a great book by Dr. David Montgomery, Dirt to Soil, which is all about that.
Is there one farmer or is there somebody that is bringing this to the forefront, or somebody who's doing this or making the change? Like, how do we narrow it down to like who's doing this? Or
yeah, I think, well, I mean, it's really a movement within agriculture. And it's exciting to me when I talk to people who are really active in this space in terms of trying to move agriculture in this direction, is they've told me how much more interest there is within the farming community in what they're doing. So like Dr. Alan Williams is someone who works on sustainable grazing practices. And he's told me he used to talk to rooms of 2 or 3 people, and now he's talking to rooms of hundreds or thousands of people when he goes to agricultural events. So a really good example is somebody like Gabe Brown, who's a farmer in North Dakota. And he's an extremely thoughtful, intelligent person. And he had just a 2 crop farm, which was, a very simple almost monocultural crop, soy and corn. That's all he raised. And he, over time, over the last couple of decades, made it much more complex. He added a lot of different things to his farm. He started always using cover crops and had hundreds of different seeds that he used, and just he was trying to make it more like an ecosystem. I mean, I don't think he started out with that idea day one, but that's where he went over time. And he added various different kinds of animals and lots of different plant crops, and just made it a much more complex system. So he's a really intriguing example of someone, and he's written a book called Dirt to Soil. And his book is all about how he took essentially a biologically dead monocrop farm and turned it into an ecosystem. And he's a great example of the idea of regenerative farming, where you're really trying to understand, how is this landscape meant to work? What are the systems that are here, that, the water systems? What is the soil meant to be here? What is the wildlife that's meant to be here? And really try to understand, how do we produce food in a way that is in harmony with these natural resources? And this is something that there were, indigenous people in many parts of the world that had very sustainable farming systems, because they understood the natural world much better than we do today. So there's a movement now that I think is quite exciting, and there's a lot of traction within mainstream agriculture to move more toward that kind of regenerative thing.
Because it's all so connected. And I think that's the super frustrating part. I think, part of the reason I think hearing from you and other experts in this field is people feel so helpless. We don't know what we can do. You look at the climate change, you look at the environmental damage these farms are causing, all these crazy weather patterns, all these things that are happening in COVID around us, but you feel so helpless to do anything. So the last thing I want to do is produce content out there that makes people feel like, oh my gosh, it's just impossible. So what can we do? What are small things? People ask me sometimes, well, I don't know, what can I do? How can I help? And I say, well, my dad said this to me, and I said, well, eat less meat. Like, don't eat meat. I'm not saying never eat meat, but eat less meat. And that people didn't used to eat meat every single day. But what would you say? Because I think also moms have the power of the purse. And as in news, we always targeted our viewer as age 25 to 54. That was the biggest spender. That's the advertisers. They wanted to target the female 25, 54. And I think the same is true for this. They've got the power of the purse. They can make decisions in the grocery store. What can people do on an individual basis to support better environmental practices and more humane meat?
I mean, ironically, I actually encourage people to get out of the grocery store. There isn't very much good food in the grocery store, unfortunately. And I know for people living in big cities, especially, and also suburban areas, they often think that's really their only choice. And I've lived in those kind of places for much of my life, so I understand that. But I've also learned that with a little bit of effort, you can find lots of alternative ways of getting your food that you didn't know were there. I mean, I always encourage people, grow anything that you can. If you have a little bit of land, if you have a terrace even, grow a little bit. It actually isn't just about, getting better food, but there's a whole process of being more connected with our nourishment, being more connected with the soil, being more connected with our whole, history of feeding ourselves from the beginning and not just buying something that's already ready to eat. So I really encourage that. I encourage people to get to farmers markets, to get to, find out what else is available in terms of, community supported agriculture, CSAs in your community where you can buy directly from farmers. Then you can really learn where your food is coming from. And the food is much more in general, this is a broad statement, but it's really true. It's generally more nourishing food. It has actually got more nutrition and more flavor. And those things are closely connected because flavor actually signals nutrition. And that's how, humans and our ancestors, pre-human ancestors, knew there was nutrition in something based on its flavor. So I'm really into encouraging people to try to think a little bit more about and be a little more creative in terms of how you get your food. And try to find food, eat less processed food. That would be my big slogan is don't eat as much prepackaged or processed foods. It's convenient, it's fast, it's easy, it's often affordable, but it's rarely a good choice from the perspective of your own health or from the perspective of, sort of the ecological impact, because not only are the ingredients in processed foods generally from kind of the worst sort of production systems, but they're also going through a lot of additional processes before they get to you. So that reduces the nutrition and it also makes it more ecologically intensive to produce that food. So it's kind of like the worst thing that you could put into your grocery
What
cart.
about kids? What about kids who are eating, like my kids this morning ate some like Halloween gummies and they wanted sun chips, and like what do you do with them with kids and stuff? I know with your boys, what do they eat?
Yeah, and mine are 9 and 13, and it's a daily struggle. I really, I feel for anybody with kids because the problem is we don't have all that much control over what they even have access to and what they see and what they're aware of. And so, I think 50 years ago, it was a little bit easier to control what kids were eating because there weren't so many options in so many places and so much processed foods everywhere. It's just saturated now. So I feel the thing I try to do every day is get them to eat as much real food as possible. I make sure they have a good breakfast before they leave the house, and every single morning they have some fresh fruit and usually yogurt and often bacon or eggs, and then usually some juice and maybe some toast or something like that. But I try to, give them real food and rather than convenience food and everything. You're talking about gummies and stuff like that. They love that stuff. But I have everything like that is put away and they have to have eaten, a real meal in order before they get some of that stuff. So that's, it's just kind of the way we try to manage it around here. But I think it's really challenging. When we're trying to feed kids to get them to eat well. But I think feeding them a variety of foods and also getting them involved as much as possible. Like I was mentioning about if you can garden at all, do it. I have my kids as much as possible with me in the garden. And I've realized that if they actually have helped grow something or even just pick it, they will eat it. And it's super interesting. If they're in the garden, they'll eat anything. They'll eat a straight kale leaf right off of the plant and they'll just eat it. And then I bring it into the kitchen and they're still likely to eat it, but a little bit less likely. And then if I got it from someplace else and it's the exact same food, they might not want to eat it at all. So it's super interesting. Like there's a connection that they feel and even a sense of ownership if they were involved in raising it. But I also bring them grocery shopping. And if I go to a farmer's market or a farm to get food directly, I bring them to that too. And they love seeing where their food is from and knowing, and I get them involved in the cooking too. So, all of that takes time. My husband always says to me, "Oh my gosh, it takes you so much more time to cook when you have the kids with you. And how do you do that?" And I said, "This is a long-term plan." I've told him this is an investment I'm making in them in long term, and I can see already that's been paying off because they have a lot of interest in eating well, and they have a lot of knowledge about food and where it comes from. So it's hard to do all that, but I think everybody we should try and do as much as we can of all those things.
That's super inspiring. And I noted, I have garden boxes in my backyard, and they will eat like the snap peas and I can't get carrots to grow. I don't know what's wrong with my soil. I can't get the carrots to grow. Tomatoes this year were not great. My tomatoes didn't turn out, but they do. I agree with you. They do eat it if it's out there. So I want to, in our final minutes here, what would you say to just in terms of, people who feel helpless in light of the, tough headlines or even with some of this other content at these factory farms, what can we do to take back some power? Stay out of the grocery stores, you said, pay attention to what you're purchasing, support independent farmers and farmers markets. If I'm just a mom who happens to see this on Instagram or when I'm scrolling through, what's like a message you'd like to share with them about buying maybe back to meat again?
If you are in a situation where you're buying your groceries in a grocery store, which most of us are. I mean, I go to grocery stores too, so I'm not telling people never go, but just try to find other places as well to get your food from. But when you're in a grocery store, there are some things that you can do to try to get the best possible food for yourself and your family. And I'd say number one, try to buy, real whole foods and then do simple preparations at home. So just learning some basic things about how to cook is really helpful if you weren't, brought up in a home where you learned how to cook. And then I would say in terms of the labels for dairy and meat products, I always encourage people, look for something that says it was pasture raised. Organic is a good label too, but I don't, it doesn't necessarily have to be organic, but if it's raised on grass, that's a really good sign that that's healthy food that was well raised. And just having, making that kind of some of the basic principles. And then when it comes to meat, I always encourage people to try to find a place where you can buy some of the lesser known cuts of meat that take a little bit more cooking in terms of maybe a little more time, like slow cook, low temp cooking of alternative cuts of meat. And one example of this is beef cheeks, which is a strange, I'd never eaten beef cheeks in my life, And so I didn't really even know about this, but this is something I've learned about in recent years from my husband. And this is actually very affordable, very nutritious, and really tasty cut of meat that you can get at a lot of different places, like even Walmart sells beef cheeks, but it's much less expensive. So you can get that if you know a good source of meat in your community, a farmer, a rancher, or a store that sells good meat, and you ask for things like that, and you do slow cooking on it, it can be very affordable to get high quality meat, well raised meat.
So, do you and Bill, but obviously both eat meat, both of you guys?
Yes, I was a vegetarian for
Oh,
33
wow.
years, but I'm not anymore.
Okay. And do you ever feel, did you ever have like an instance where there was an animal you just loved so much you couldn't send it on, like you kept it around, or did you ever build that kind of connection with an animal?
Well, every farm or ranch I've ever been to has a few animals that are kind of given a special status because you do have a connection with all of your animals, but there are one or two that really, sort of become your particular favorites. And we had one here called Girlfriend that was my cow that was our special friend, and she lived to be 23 years old. So we didn't, she was just allowed to die a natural death and was buried on the ranch after she died, because it was just kind of one of those things where you said, well, this is not one we're going to eat. But for the most part, the animals that you really particularly like are still animals that you're going to end up eating, because ultimately you're trying to give all of these animals a good life and a good death, like we talked about before, or, I should say a death that isn't painful or causes fear. But they're here because you're creating human nourishment. And I think that's a valid thing to do. I mean, I believe in it. And I think the food that we produce is extremely nourishing. And I'm, really happy that we're part of producing really healthy food for people, including our own family, of course.
Perfectly said. And so you are raising and selling meat still, but it's not called Niman. What is your ranch called now?
Yeah, we actually, my husband was the founder of Niman Ranch and was the CEO, and then he left it about 14 years ago, I think. And then we started another small company called Beyond Ranch. And we did that for about 8 years. And now we're just selling from our own farm directly to a few local consumers, and we just call it Bill Niman Farms. So we don't really have a label or anything right now. We've gone back to the smallest possible unit at
That
this
sounds
point.
actually kind of nice. That's great.
Yeah, it is. It's a lot less complicated.
Yes, I bet.
That's what we're looking for these days.
I'm
So
sure. And then if I want to link up your books, is Amazon still the best place to send them, or do you have a better place where I could do a link?
yeah, everything's on Amazon. And then the last two books I wrote are both called Defending Beef. I wrote an earlier version of that, and then I redid it completely and have a new version of that out. And that's at Chelsea Green Publishing, and they have a nice website that has some more content of my own. So that might be a good place to send them. They have some articles that I've written and stuff linked on there too. So Chelsea Green Publishing probably would be the better source, but all three of them are on Amazon.
Perfect. Well, Nicolette, thank you so much. I may have a couple questions I could ask you, but thank you for this great content.
Okay, Peggy, thank you.
Okay, Courtney, we've talked before about how you just recently moved from LA, where you lived for how many years did you live in LA?
10.
10 years.
Yeah.
And you had your kids there and worked there for a decade. And you guys are both from Minnesota, right? Or your husband?
I'm from around Chicago. So I'm Midwestern but not Minnesota. My husband is from Minnesota.
Got
So we
it.
moved back
And
here,
so
yeah.
you guys made this big decision to move. I remember you telling me, and it was a very big shift, but now you have actual space and nature,
Yeah.
but also you went to this cool, really, it sounds amazingly cool, new restaurant called the Awamni.
Yeah,
Awamni
it's called
by
Awamni by the sous chef. It is a native restaurant. It has cuisine that is all meant to be focused on indigenous cuisine, but it's modern, a modern take on that. And so they really are rejecting what they're describing as colonized ingredients, and Eurocentric ingredients, which is a lot of factory farming ingredients. So on this menu, there's no beef, there's no chicken, there's no dairy products, nothing like that at all, which is, and yet it's not a vegan restaurant. So they have, wild game, they have fish, they have bison on the menu, things like that.
that. I'm looking at a couple pictures. I'm looking right now at an elk sandwich.
Yeah.
Did you
And
get that?
no, I did not. They basically changed they do a seasonal menu for the
Yeah.
different seasons. So I saw the summer menu. I got stuffed tomatoes.
Oh,
And you could share them. So there was like four of them between me, my husband, and my toddler. It was actually enough food. We were like, how many plates we need? And she was like, you'll be fine with that, which no server ever tells you that, by
ever
the
says
way.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, thank you, actually. You're right. It is enough food.
It
And then they
looks
had these
amazing.
it's so good. They had these corn cookies with jam that had like it's blueberry jam and cloudberry jam. Just
I don't
really
even know what a
beautiful.
cloudberry is.
I think it's yeah.
Here's a bison tartare,
Hmm.
which I guess I guess you can still just get free roaming bison and anything that's not colonized, which I imagine for us that would be like poultry that we introduced. And
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
interesting, no dairy. I never really thought about that Native Americans weren't big dairy
No, I mean it's a
eaters.
totally that ingredient has to be so processed, really, no matter what you're doing, pretty much. Like there's a whole process just to get dairy, right? Like as we are learning through this show. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
you know,
here they have a wild rice sorbet and like a chocolate sauce. That looks
yeah.
amazing.
Oh my gosh, and that's such a thing in Minnesota too. The wild rice is
Oh, is it?
yeah,
That's one of the
I'm learning more about it. As I learn, I will share more info, but I did just at Iris's school meet another mom who she works for a nonprofit where they do a lot of work to do wild rice conservation. So,
Oh,
because it's a big food source up here and it's something that needs to be protected. So I guess her big thing was people harvest the rice, and there's a lot of people who do go out ricing, and you go on a boat and you beat the rice.
oh my, there's
Um,
a ricing. It's an activity,
it's an
ricing.
activity, and then you're meant to reseed the water around you after you
Whoa,
do
that is
that.
so
So,
cool.
and she said a lot of people don't do that. So it's an interesting thing to learn about. It's a whole new environment. Coming from LA and knowing kind of the environmental issues and what the landscape there looked like compared to what it is here, and
Oh
it
my
is very
gosh.
different. So,
Yeah, there's no one
um,
ricing in LA. I
no,
can
no, no,
say that
no.
with 100% certainty.
No, but it's really cool that this restaurant exists because I feel like there are a lot of native people up here. And I had actually just said out loud, I was like, I feel like I haven't really tried like native cuisine properly. And I wish there were more restaurants where I could experience it. And it was like, I found out about Awamni and I was like, oh, wow, there is. There is.
It's the exact, and I'm looking at the chef too. I mean, very interesting and very strict sort of guidelines. He says
Hmm.
clean ingredients, nose to tail cooking.
Hmm.
He's a
Mm.
Aglala Lakota chef and
Hmm.
founder of the Sous Chef. So check it out. And these pictures are really cool. It makes me wish that Minneapolis were a bit closer. And it's on the water too, right? Looks
Yeah,
gorgeous.
it's beautiful. It's a beautiful spot, but it's really cool that it exists because you could go with anybody there. If you're a vegan, if you're a meat eater, if you're whatever, you'd go there, but you still wouldn't be supporting factory farming. So this is like an interesting take on the people who are meat eaters who don't want to give it up, like you always talk about, Peggy, but they want to experience something, that is not factory farming. Like maybe just find a way to make that choice. And I think this is an
Exactly.
interesting way to do it. And also kind of
Yeah,
the
no, really.
history of this land and the way that people did eat here, you
Very
know?
cool. That
So
is like a must visit. Now there's like he's giving Paul Bunyan a run for the attention when people come to Minneapolis.
exactly, exactly. The two
Let's
destinations.
park Paul Bunyan for a minute. Everybody go check out the
Yeah,
Awami
exactly.
by Sous Chef, which it looks amazing. So great tip. Thanks so much. We're getting all the good tips here from Minneapolis. Love it. Thanks, Courtney.
You're welcome.
If you liked what you heard, please follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really liked what you heard, please leave us a rating and a review. Know It All is a production of Peggy Bunker Media. Editing, producing, and recording is done by the team at Resonate Recordings. I'm Peggy Bunker, and now you know it all.